April 13th, 1970. Three astronauts are hurtling through the vacuum of space, right? Roughly 200,000 miles from Earth.
Wow.
Yeah, and suddenly an oxygen tank explodes. Alarms are just blaring everywhere. Power is plummeting. And within hours, the crew of Apollo 13 is facing this terrifying new reality. They're exhaling carbon dioxide into this tiny confined cabin.
And scrubbers designed to filter it out are just failing.
Exactly. It is the ultimate life or death problem. You either solve it or, well, you don't survive. But okay, let's bring it back down to earth for a second. Picture this. It's 11:59 p.m. You have this massive career-making report due tomorrow.
Oh, I know where this is going.
Right. You hit print and nothing. The printer just sits there, completely silent, no error message, just mocking you.
Yeah, the stakes are obviously wildly different, but biologically speaking, your brain actually goes through a remarkably similar sequence in both of those scenarios.
Really, even with the printer?
Oh, absolutely. The stress spikes. And your mind suddenly has to, shift gears from whatever it was doing into immediate high-pressure troubleshooting.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. For this exploration, we're actually trying something a little different today to really get into the mechanics of how you, the listener, solve problems. So we're adopting a specific dynamic.
We are.
I'm going to step into the role of the curious student.
That's right. And I'll be taking on the role of the lecturer.
Right.
And our mission today is to really map out the architecture of human problem solving. We're going to explore the mental strategies you deploy every single day.
And maybe more importantly, expose those hidden roadblocks and biases that cause your brain to just get completely derailed.
Exactly.
So to guide us, the material we're unpacking today is section 7.3 of chapter 7 from Psychology 2E. It offers this brilliant dissection of exactly what's happening in our neural pathways when we face a hurdle. So lecturer, before we can even begin to fix that broken printer or, filter out that carbon dioxide, what is the brain's very first move?
Well, the textbook establishes that before any strategy can be applied, the absolute first step is clearly identifying the problem itself.
Which sounds incredibly basic.
It does, yeah. But our brains often skip it entirely out of panic. Like, are we dealing with a broken printer or is it simply a disconnected USB cable?
Right.
If you misidentify the problem, literally every solution you attempt is going to fail.
That makes sense.
But once the parameters of the problem are actually defined, we open up the cognitive problem-solving toolbox. And the first two tools you'll reach for are the most rigid. That's trial and error and algorithms.
Okay, trial and error seems pretty universal. It's the try again method, right? You change one variable, see if it works, and if not, you just move to the next.
Yeah, it's universal because it requires very little upfront planning.
Yeah.
With the printer, trial and error is, checking the ink levels.
Right.
Then checking the paper tray for a jam. Then wiggling the laptop connection. We do this with our phones constantly, right? When an app freezes, you close it.
And if it's still frozen, you toggle the Wi-Fi.
Exactly. Then you just restart the whole device. You're throwing solutions at the wall to see what sticks. It's highly common, but it's just terribly inefficient in terms of time.
Which naturally pushes us toward the second tool, the algorithm. And clarify this for me, when we say algorithm here, we aren't just talking about the hidden code feeding you videos on social media, are we?
Not exclusively, no. In cognitive psychology, an algorithm is really just a step-by-step formula that guarantees a desired outcome. It provides highly detailed, completely inflexible instructions.
Meaning if you do it right, you get the same result.
Exactly. If you execute every step perfectly, you achieve the exact same result every single time. So sure, a computer search engine uses an algorithm, but so does an instructional video for installing complex software.
Okay, let's unpack this. If an algorithm is like a highly detailed Michelin star baking recipe where you have to measure out exact grams of flour and bake at precisely 350 degrees to guarantee a flawless cake,
Right.
then trial and error is just throwing random ingredients into a bowl until something tastes somewhat edible.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it, yes.
But here's my issue with that. My life rarely affords me the time to follow a flawless step-by-step recipe, right? Nor can I afford to just guess randomly until things magically work out. If those are our only two tools, we'd be paralyzed all day.
Well, you've hit on the exact evolutionary pressure that forced the human brain to develop the third and arguably most important tool in our toolbox.
The heuristic?
The heuristic. See, the brain is a massive consumer of energy. Running algorithms is computationally heavy. It burns a ton of cognitive glucose. So to save energy, we developed the heuristic, which is a general problem-solving framework. It's a mental shortcut.
So like a rule of thumb that gets us from point A to point B without needing a highly detailed map.
Yes. It's designed to save you time and mental exertion.
Mhm.
However, the critical trade-off, and this is really where things get dangerous,
Mhm.
is that despite those time-saving characteristics, a heuristic does not guarantee a rational, accurate, or perfect decision.
It just guarantees a fast one.
Exactly, just a fast one.
I see. So when does my brain actually make that calculation? When does it decide to just abandon the safety of an algorithm and roll the dice on a mental shortcut?
Well, Section 7.3 outlines 5 specific environmental conditions that trigger your brain to use a heuristic. Your mind automatically defaults to these shortcuts when you're faced with too much information,
Okay.
when your time to make a decision is extremely limited, when the decision itself is deemed unimportant, when you have very little information to work with, or when a relevant rule of thumb just happens to pop into your conscious mind at that exact moment.
Wow, that tracks perfectly with human survival. Like, if I'm driving and a deer jumps into the road, I have limited time and a sudden overload of sensory information.
Right, you're doing the math.
Exactly. I'm not running a physics algorithm to calculate the optimal braking distance. I'm using a heuristic slam on the brakes and swerve away from the obstacle.
And we use these same shortcuts for high-level planning too, not just sudden, terrifying reactions. One of the most common frameworks the textbook details is called working backwards.
Oh, I use this one all the time.
Yeah, it's where you begin your planning by anchoring your focus entirely on the end result.
Yeah, the textbook gives a really great scenario for this. Say you live in Washington, D.C., and you need to attend a wedding in Philadelphia. The ceremony starts at 4:00 p.m. You want to arrive by 3:30 p.m. to grab a good seat. You know the drive takes roughly 2.5 hours, but you have to take Interstate 95, which is, famous for nightmare traffic.
Right, so if you try to plan that trip starting from your current time, the variables just become completely overwhelming. So instead, you use the working backwards heuristic.
You start at the end.
Yes, you start at the 3:30 p.m. arrival time, you subtract the 2.5 hours, then you subtract another hour as a buffer for the I-95 traffic, and suddenly you have a hard departure time of 12:00 p.m. The brain simplified a complex logistical problem just by reversing the chronological flow.
That's brilliant. And another powerful heuristic mentioned is breaking it down. This is taking a massive monolithic task that triggers anxiety and splitting it into a series of highly manageable subtasks.
Like a huge paper.
Yeah, imagine a student staring down a 20-page research essay. If they look at it as a writing 20 pages, their brain encounters too much information and just freezes.
So they break it down. Step 1, brainstorm topics. Step 2, formulate a thesis. Step 3, gather 3 primary sources. By segmenting the task, you prevent the brain from getting overwhelmed and triggering that panic response.
Okay, hold on. Let me put my student hat firmly on and challenge this a bit.
Go for it.
If heuristics are just our brains taking the lazy, low-energy way out, aren't we just hardwiring ourselves to make careless mistakes? I mean, why would evolution favor cognitive laziness? Can we actually train these problem-solving skills to become sharper, or are we doomed to just rely on sloppy shortcuts?
Well, it's not laziness, really. It's efficiency. Speed often trumped perfect accuracy in human evolution. But to answer your question, yes, we can absolutely train these pathways.
Okay, good.
The brain acts very much like a muscle. It requires the friction of complex problem solving to stay sharp. When a heuristic fails, your brain is literally forced to build new synaptic connections to formulate a new algorithm. And the textbook points out that many people actively seek out puzzles to generate this exact cognitive friction.
Sudoku is a classic example of this, right? Section 7.3 uses a simplified 4x4 grid as an example rather than the massive 9x9 version.
Right.
So you have a grid with empty boxes, and you have to fill them using the digits 1 through 4. The constraint is that the numbers must total 10 in each defined box, row, and column without ever repeating a digit.
And what's happening neurologically when you play Sudoku is just fascinating. You're essentially mental plate spinning. Your brain attempts a heuristic like, oh, I'll just put a 4 here because it feels right.
But then you realize it violates a rule in the column.
Exactly, the heuristic fails. You experience a spike of frustration, which is literally the sensation of your brain being forced to expend energy to build a rigid algorithmic process to check every intersecting line.
But numbers are one thing, Spatial reasoning is a whole different beast. I want to talk about the 9-dot puzzle.
Oh, this one is great.
For those listening, imagine a square grid made of 9 dots on a piece of paper. The challenge is to connect all 9 dots using only 4 straight, continuous lines without ever lifting your pencil.
It is notoriously difficult for first-timers.
Because your brain instantly projects an artificial boundary. You look at the square shape the dots form, and your heuristic tells you stay inside the lines.
Yep.
But mathematically, it is impossible to solve if you stay within the perimeter of the dots. To succeed, you literally have to draw your lines extending out into the blank, empty space of the paper to change the angles. You have to break the invisible parameters your own mind created.
Which is such a beautiful metaphor for overcoming a cognitive block.
Yeah.
There's also a brilliant logic challenge from Sam Lloyd, a legendary puzzle creator called Puzzling Scales.
Ooh.
It's an exercise in algebraic substitution, but without using numbers. You're shown images of balancing scales. First, you see a top balancing perfectly with 3 alphabet blocks. Then, the same blocks on top are placed on a new scale and balanced against a handful of marbles.
Okay.
Finally, you're asked to deduce exactly how many marbles it will take to balance just the top.
Spoiler alert for anyone listening, it takes 9 marbles. But what makes it such a workout is that you have to hold abstract weights in your working memory and swap them out. You can't just guess. You are forced to synthesize multiple data points into a cohesive rule.
And doing this regularly keeps your cognitive flexibility high. But, student, all of this practice naturally brings us to a rather frustrating paradox.
Oh, I know exactly where you're going with this. If we possess this incredibly adaptive toolbox and we can train our brains with complex logic, why do we still find ourselves completely stumped by painfully simple real-world problems?
Because sometimes the very shortcuts that save us time end up turning into prisons. The first major trap we fall into is called a mental set. This occurs when you persist in approaching a problem using a strategy that has worked for you in the past, even when it is demonstrably failing in the present moment.
The textbook offers a wonderfully frustrating scenario for this. Imagine walking into a room with 4 doorways. For years, you've always used one specific doorway to exit. It's an ingrained habit.
Right.
Today, you walk up to that door, turn the handle, and it's locked. But instead of simply stepping back and looking around, you keep jiggling the handle. You pull harder, you push.
Yeah.
You're so locked into the heuristic that this door equals exit that you completely ignore the fact that the other 3 doorways are standing wide open just a few feet away.
Because your brain has calculated that the heuristic has a 99% success rate historically. It refuses to update its statistical model based on one failure, so it traps you in a mental set. But an even more specific and arguably more dangerous subcategory of the mental set is functional fixedness. This is a cognitive bias, where you're unable to perceive an object being used for anything other than its originally intended design.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because asserting that we are blind to objects is a pretty bold claim. How did psychologists actually prove that we suffer from this fixedness?
Well, the foundational evidence comes from a brilliant psychologist named Carl Duncker in 1945. He designed a very elegant experiment. Participants were brought into a room and handed 3 distinct items: a candle, a book of matches, and a small cardboard box filled with thumbtacks.
Okay.
The instruction was straightforward. Attach the candle to the wall in a way that prevents the melting wax from dripping onto the table below.
Knowing human nature, I'm assuming people tried to melt the bottom of the candle and stick it to the wall like glue. Or maybe they tried to force a tiny thumbtack straight through the thick wax.
They did. And both of those methods fail completely. The participants were crippled by functional fixedness. They look at the cardboard box, and their brains assigned it a singular identity, a container holding the tacks.
They couldn't see it as anything else.
Yet, they couldn't strip away that intended design to see its physical properties as a flat surface. The actual solution is to empty the box, use a thumbtack to pin the empty cardboard box to the wall, and sit the candle inside it. The container becomes a shelf.
That is wild. The brain's categorization engine is so strong it actually blinds us to physical reality. And this isn't just a quirky parlor trick. Which brings us back to our hook at the very beginning of the deep dive, the Apollo 13 crisis.
Exactly. When the scrubbers failed on Apollo 13, Mission Control couldn't just overnight a new part to space. The engineers on the ground had to overcome severe functional fixedness under immense pressure. They had to look at a pile of seemingly useless materials the astronauts had on board: plastic bags, cardboard from flight manuals, duct tape, and spare hoses.
They had to literally strip away the intended design of those items. A manual wasn't a book to read anymore, it was structural support. A plastic bag wasn't for storage, it was an airtight seal.
Yes.
By breaking out of functional fixedness, they engineered a makeshift, life-saving carbon dioxide filter. They literally fit a square peg into a round hole using tape and cardboard.
It is the absolute pinnacle of cognitive flexibility. But, it raises an interesting anthropological question. Is functional fixedness purely a byproduct of our modern environment?
Right, because we grow up in highly industrialized nations surrounded by incredibly specialized tools. We have like an avocado slicer, a garlic press, a specific USB-C charger for a specific device. Does living in a world where everything has exactly one hyper-specific purpose destroy our ability to improvise?
Researchers actually tested that exact hypothesis. They traveled to the Amazon basin in Ecuador to conduct experiments with the Shuar group, a non-industrialized culture. The researchers presented participants with a hypothetical problem, a story about a bear and a rabbit separated by a river, and asked them to choose an object from a selection of items to act as a bridge for the animals.
And among the items was a spoon, which was the only object physically long enough to span this imaginary river.
Correct. But the genius of the experiment was in the presentation. When the researchers presented the spoon in a way that highlighted its intended function, say, resting inside a cup or holding a piece of food, it took the participants significantly longer to recognize it as a potential bridge. The context locked their perception.
Because their brains saw it doing spoon things, they couldn't perceive it as a miniature piece of lumber.
The conclusion was profound. Functional fixedness is a universal human trait. It doesn't matter if you live in a high-tech metropolis or the Amazon rainforest. The human brain universally loves to categorize objects into neat little boxes and just throw away the key.
Okay, we've explored how our brains get stuck on physical objects, like thumbtack boxes and spoons. But I want to pivot to the abstract. What happens when the problem we are trying to solve isn't physical? What happens when the problem is simply making a logical judgment or navigating a social situation? How does our reasoning get hijacked?
Now we're entering the territory of cognitive biases. Think of heuristics as shortcuts that usually work, but biases are systemic, predictable errors in our thinking, and they exist largely to protect the ego and preserve our pre-existing worldview.
Why is that?
Because it requires massive amounts of cognitive energy to admit you were wrong and update your belief system. So your brain deploys cognitive biases to filter reality in a way that proves you were right all along.
Okay, I want to see if I can map out the 5 major decision biases from section 7.3 without just reading them off a list. Let's invent a scenario. Let's follow a single person, let's calm the listener going about a normal week, and watch how his reasoning systematically breaks down. You grade me on the biases.
Sounds like a plan.
Let's start with the listener trying to rent a new apartment. He has a strict budget of $1,600 a month. He meets a rather manipulative real estate agent.
A perfect setup for the anchoring bias. This occurs when you fixate on a single piece of information, usually the very first number or fact you're presented with, and use it as the baseline for all subsequent decisions.
Okay.
We don't possess an internal absolute value scale. We only understand better or worse compared to a reference point.
Yeah.
So the manipulative agent shows the listener 3 absolutely horrendous rundown apartments, all priced at exactly $1,600.
So the listener's brain anchors to the idea that $1,600 equals garbage. Then the agent shows a decent, clean apartment, but it costs $2,000 a month. Suddenly, the listener rationalizes blowing his budget because, compared to the anchor, it feels like a necessary upgrade. He completely forgets to check if there are other, better $1,600 apartments on the market.
He was entirely hijacked by the anchor. Moving on in our narrative, the listener signs the lease and decides he really likes his new landlord. He thinks the landlord's a fantastic guy.
Which triggers confirmation bias.
Exactly. This is the human tendency to hyper-focus on information that confirms your existing beliefs while actively ignoring evidence that contradicts them.
Right. So the landlord comes by to fix a light bulb, and the listener thinks, see, what a great guy. But when the landlord ignores 3 urgent emails about a leaking pipe, the listener rationalizes it like, oh, he's probably just busy. The listener acts as the editor of his own reality documentary, leaving all the contradicting evidence on the cutting room floor just to protect his initial judgment.
Precisely. Now, let's introduce a neighbor. The listener sees a guy in the hallway wearing a ripped leather jacket and covered in tattoos.
Yeah.
Based on a faulty way of thinking called the representative bias, the listener immediately assumes this neighbor is a delinquent or a criminal.
Because the neighbor fits the listener's internal stereotype or representative model of what trouble looks like, even though in reality the neighbor is, I don't know, a tenured literature professor who rides a motorcycle on weekends.
The representative bias is assuming a person or event was perfectly match a category based on superficial traits. The textbook points out how dangerous this can be in medicine.
Oh, really?
Yeah. An urgent care nurse might be highly efficient at diagnosing a heart attack in an older male patient, but completely missed the exact same symptoms in a younger female patient. The female patient doesn't fit the unintentional, ingrained representative model of a heart attack victim, so the life-saving heuristic is never triggered.
That is terrifyingly real. Okay, back to the listener's apartment. He's settling in, and he turns on the local news. He sees a sensationalized story about a burglary in a neighborhood 10 miles away. Suddenly, he's buying 3 new deadbolts for his door. Why?
Because of the availability heuristic.
Yes.
That happens when you base a decision on the most recent, vivid, or easily recalled memory available in your mind, regardless of the actual statistical probability. Even if local crime is down 50% this year, the dramatic image of the burglary is highly available to his consciousness. It overrides data with pure emotion.
And finally, a month later, the leaking pipe the landlord ignored finally bursts, flooding the listener's kitchen. As he's standing in ankle-deep water, the listener says, "I knew it. I knew that landlord was trouble from day one."
Which brings us to the final mind trap, hindsight bias. This is the "I knew it all along" phenomenon. It is the illusion that an unpredictable event was entirely predictable after it has already occurred.
Right. The listener didn't know the pipe would burst. He thought the landlord was great.
But the brain hates chaos. To create a false sense of order and predictability, it literally rewrites history to make the listener feel like he was in control the whole time.
So what does this all mean? If we step back and look at the whole picture, the trial and error, the cognitive load of algorithms, the mental sets, the rigid functional fixedness, and this whole cascade of biases, it paints a pretty complicated picture of human intelligence.
Well, let's drop the lecture and student roles for a moment. Synthesizing all of section 7.3, the ultimate takeaway is that your brain is a remarkable, highly efficient machine designed to navigate a complex, overwhelming world without burning out. But that exact same efficiency is what blinds you to reality.
It is a daily conscious battle against our own mental shortcuts. So for you listening, the next time you are stuck on a problem, whether you're troubleshooting a massive logistical issue at work, trying to navigate a misunderstanding in a relationship, or just staring at that silent, broken printer at midnight, force yourself to pause. Take a breath and ask the hard questions.
Like, am I pulling on a locked door while 3 others are wide open?
Or, am I anchored to a bad piece of data? Or, am I looking at a box of thumbtacks and refusing to see a shelf?
Awareness is the absolute required first step to breaking a mental set. Once you accept that your brain is actively trying to trick you into taking the path of least resistance, you can start deploying the algorithms necessary to find the actual truth.
Building on that, it leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time discussing how the brain needs the friction of complex puzzles and trial and error to forge new neural pathways and keep our problem-solving skills sharp. But look at the modern world.
Yeah.
Every single day, we are increasingly outsourcing our daily decisions to the invisible algorithms of artificial intelligence.
The machines are doing the heavy lifting. The algorithms curate the news you read. They suggest the responses to your emails. And GPS apps solve the spatial puzzle of navigating traffic before you even turn the steering wheel.
Exactly. If we are constantly allowing external algorithms to solve our problems before we even consciously realize we have them, are we actively starving our own brains of the friction required to stay sharp?
Oh.
If human problem solving is a muscle and we've stopped lifting the weights, what happens when the digital systems fail and we are forced to rely on our own atrophied heuristics?
It's a phenomenal question. What happens when the metaphorical printer breaks and the machine can't save you?
Keep that in mind the next time you find yourself blindly following the blue line on your GPS instead of learning the streets of your own city. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of the mind. We'll catch you on the next one.